Well, this is Good Afternoon, Ghana. My name is Aldo Moro. This afternoon, we are asking the question, is the Vice President and the standard bearer or the flag bearer of the New Patriotic Party distancing himself or dissociating himself from the sitting president? It's been one of the biggest talk in town since he delivered that speech last week where he outlined his vision and his plan of action should Ghanaians vote for him. Now, after that event, there's been a lot of talk about the fact that the vice president has thrown his boss under the bus. There's an attempt by the vice president to distance himself, to absolve himself, to extricate himself, whatever verb that you want to use. But that's been one of the debatable issues ever since the vice president delivered that speech. This afternoon, we intend to interrogate that based on some specific things that the vice president has said and to find out if indeed it is a case of the vice president attempting to dissociate himself or attempting to extricate himself or to distance himself from Nana Addo Akufo Addo, and whether it would actually help him. Which of the two will help him? Should he distance himself from Akufo Addo, or he should just be there, carry the cross, accept the assets and liabilities? That's what we intend to talk about on Good Afternoon, Ghana. When I come back, I will introduce my resource persons and your WhatsApp line for you to join and express your thoughts. All right, so welcome to Good Afternoon, Ghana. Good Afternoon, Ghana today is having a conversation on the back of that speech that was delivered by the Vice President, His Excellency Dr. Bawumia, who's also the standard bearer or the flag bearer of the New Patriotic Party. Last week, he stood before Ghanaians and outlined his vision and his plan of action should Ghanaians give him the nod to become the next president of Ghana. But the talk has predominantly focused on aspects about whether he's going to be his own man or he's going to be a continuation of the president, and what strategy actually works for him. Must he dissociate himself from the sitting president, basically throwing him or literally throwing him under the bus, or he must carry the cross as well and say he's going to continue from where his boss, that's President Akufo Addo, where he left off. But closely related to that is whether he's going to be his own man. Okay, and also closely related to that, what degree of believability quotient can we attribute to the president, the vice president? How credible is the vice president? All of the things that he said. Much has not been said about the substance, really, in terms of policy by policy, what he said, and whether they're feasible, whether that's what Ghana needs, etc., etc. We haven't had that much in terms of the narratives or the conversations that have come up after the vice president delivered that speech at UPSA. So we're trying to use this afternoon's program to try and establish, without any doubt, whether the vice president, what is the vice president trying to do? Is he trying to say that, well, I did my best, I proffered solutions, I wasn't listened to, and so please don't blame me, but give me a fair hearing? Or the vice president is actually not saying that. He's only saying that, yes, I accept that we did some good things, but there were other things that didn't go well, so give me another opportunity. So what is the vice president trying to say? What is he communicating? What is his posture like? What kind of person did we see last week, Saturday? So it's more to do with the form, not necessarily the substance per se in terms of what the vice president intends to do. So let's do this first of all. Let me introduce my resource persons. My resource persons right here in the studio is a man who has actually authored a book. He's the author of the book. One of the things I like to do is that when I invite my resource persons, I like to be very specific about certain things. I don't want to just say anything. So Dr. Akufo is the author of Bawumia and the Modern Vice Presidency. He's joined us in the studio. He was with me before the vice president delivered that speech, and I told him that we'll beg him to try and get us and get him back in the studio for us to analyze some aspects of it. He's taking time off his very, very busy schedule to join us. Doc, thank you so very much for time. It's a pleasure having you.
Hi, thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Thank you. And let me also say that I have Dr. John Osai Kwapon, who is a CDD fellow and also a political scientist. But he often, yes, as usual, will join us via Zoom to also state his thoughts and on the topic that we have tabled before you this afternoon. Doc, thank you so very much for accepting to join us on Good Afternoon Ghana.
Good afternoon, my pleasure, and greet Doc for me as well. Tell him I said it's good to see him.
Well, he's just asked me to speak on his behalf and say, hello, how are you?
I'm doing well, Doc.
Anyway, we were actually billed to have Shamima Muslim, but something came up at the 11th hour, so she's unable to join us. We sincerely apologize for that. Let me just say that if you have any opinion that you intend to express on this topic we are looking at, let me say that you're free to send your WhatsApp message to 0244 262 314. 0244 262 314. When you listen to the Vice President, did it come across to you as somebody you can trust? Did it come across to you as somebody who's credible? Did it come across to you as somebody who can actually be his own man and not necessarily, being, essentially controlled by Dr Akufo Addo? Should the Vice President become the next leader of the next president of this country? So those are the things that are needed to tell us, and perhaps generally what you make of the speech that he delivered. I'll start with Dr. John Osai Kwapon. Doc, I'll start with you. So perhaps the first question I'm going to go through at you is this: that what's your general overview of what you make of the NPP flag bearer, the Vice President's speech on this last week? Because I haven't spoken to you since then. So what's your general overview of what you heard the Vice President say?
All right. Thank you very much. So I've actually been working on, I have planned out a 3-part, series on my take on the speech. 2 parts are down now and it's been published on the CDD Ghana blog. But the first one, which was the overall take, on the speech, before he gave the speech, I did write that I have 4 key things that I will be looking for the Vice President to do. So 1, I expected that I had this expectation of 1, he would strike the right partisan tone. 2, that he would acknowledge to some extent the economic pinch points that Ghanaians have felt over the last couple of years under this administration. I also wanted to see the Vice President reconcile the force of the many arguments and assertions made in 2016 and the case against the John Mahama administration over the economic management or otherwise of the country, but also reconcile that with the economic realities that we have seen and experienced over the last several years. And then the last expectation that I had, or at least I was looking out for this speech, was a little bit of measuredness in campaign promises. And that's because I think election cycle after election cycle, we tend to see one too many promises from our politicians, and it can have a way of getting citizens to a point of a disillusionment. So in my initial comments, let me quickly then talk about how in my opinion, how he dealt with these 4 things that I was looking for. So 1, on the question of, partisanship, that I believe strongly that the Vice President struck the right partisan tone. Okay. I think he spoke to Ghanaians as opposed to just NPP
party folks,
party supporters, right? And I say that within the context of, if you look at the Vice President from 2008 through 2016, you would see a transformation where I think he became a lot more partisan than he was in 2008. I think he sharpened his partisan edges quite a lot in 2016. So I appreciated, yes, there were a few lines in there that you can tell it was aimed at the political opposition. But in general, I appreciated that partisan, sort of the partisan balance. The second thing was, he also did acknowledge that, we have gone through some very difficult times. We have faced some difficult challenges as well. So I appreciated that about the speech, because I felt that to gloss over it would sort of have, made him come across as not empathizing with what Ghanaians have been feeling and have been voicing over some time now. So it was good that that was done. In terms of the 2016 arguments, though, I don't think I saw it in a more direct, forceful way of saying, yes, these were the arguments I made. I own them, and then sort of explain why the realities have looked different from those arguments. But in a sort of indirect way, you get a sense of that because of the regular reference in the speech to the challenges brought on by COVID and the Russian-Ukraine war. I just believe that, especially with COVID, the force of that argument is not as potent in 2023, 2024, as it was, let's say, in 2020 and 2021. On the last point on, the extent of the promises, the vice president, laid out a lot of things that he intends to do, in terms of his vision. Personally, I would have preferred a little bit of, restraint in that. And if you look at the last section of his speech, he himself recognizes that there's a certain growing, quote unquote, cynicism in the minds of voters when it comes to, things that a politician promises they will be able to do. He made reference to something to the effect of, I know you're going to say, I've heard a lot of these bright ideas before. We've heard many of these things before, etc. So again, for me, that was the worry that I had going into the speech, and was hoping that what he himself had recognized will not be something that, the audience would walk away with again, feeling the same thing, like, oh, we've heard this over and over again, not even just from you, Mr. Vice President, but we've heard other politicians, election cycle after election cycle, promise us a whole lot of things. So those are my initial comments and reactions to the speech. As we go on, I'll share a little bit more about the politics as well as my policy responses.
Yeah, but because you can tell clearly that right after the speech, the talk has often predominantly centered on more to do with form. So, or the politics of it, which is he going to be his own man? He's dissociating himself from the president. So basically, he's throwing the president under the bus. Can we trust the vice president? Does he have credibility? Does he have belief? What is his believability quotient, etc., etc.? Why do you think this narrative appears to have dominated public conversations rather than taking, some of the policy propositions that he has brought forward for public discussion and to ask about its feasibility or otherwise?
Right. So, if every presidential aspirant has to do two things, right? One, so if they are an incumbent, they get to talk about their own record. So, for example, Kufuor in 2004 seeking re-election, or John Mahama in 2016 seeking re-election, or President Akufo Addo seeking re-election in 2020. If they are the opposition candidate, they get to talk about the record of their party when they were once in office, or what they intend to do if they get elected. So again, you can think of Kufuor in 96, 2000. You can think of Mills in 2004, 2008. You can think of President Akufo Addo, in 2012 and 2016. The vice president is in a very unique position in the sense that in the Fourth Republic, this is the first time that an incumbent vice president has been elected the presidential candidate of the same party, and he's seeking to succeed, a president who is term limited. So what he's confronted with is the president's record and the party's record in office, and how does he position himself vis-a-vis that record, and also the extent to which he is culpable or not for the good and the quote-unquote bad things that have happened under this presidency. It wouldn't be so much of a political dilemma if everything had been rosy and cozy, right? So meaning, in addition to some of the key signature policies like free SHS, 1D, 1F, we didn't face some of the economic challenges that we did, resulting in, going to the IMF, debt restructuring and haircuts, et cetera, et cetera. It would have been very easy to deal with that legacy. That in that case, you can easily run on the record, and say, look, this is what we've achieved. But there's been some challenges. And if you look at Afrobarometer in 17, 19, and 2022, you actually do see drastic changes in how the public has perceived this administration. So that is the political dilemma that the vice president is in, which I pointed out even during the primaries, right? Because then now the question is, how do you position yourself in such a way that you don't come across as distancing yourself from the president or quote unquote throwing the president under the bus? And I think for some of the policies that he announced, that is what is giving that public reaction in terms of he's going to abolish the e-levy. Oh, but it was his government that introduced the e-levy. This is not a good sign. He doesn't want to have anything to do with the Nana Addo administration. On that, I don't necessarily think that some of the different policies that he's proposing is an indication of distancing. Political parties prefer or like policy continuity. But for me, I don't see that as, having policy differences is necessarily distancing. But I think you can see that there's a bit of how do we embrace the good things that I did as part of this administration without carrying the entire burden on the side of the things that didn't necessarily turn out well. So for me, the description of the vice president's role as one of the mate and not the driver, right? If God forbid, but if a car has an accident, normally who the focus is on is who is the driver. How did they drive well? Were they overspeeding? Did they try to overtake, et cetera, et cetera? So that imagery is why I can see people saying, oh, there's a bit of, this is really not all my doing because I had a limited role. For me, the one part that I have found troubling, though, is what I see to be a rewriting of the narrative of the economic management team.
Right.
So if you look at paragraph 64, the vice president talks about the EMT as an advisory body with no real decision-making authority. And that, I don't doubt that. But if we go back to 2016, there was a different narrative about the EMT, right? And so it created a certain expectation of what the economic management team is able to do. And so now, when you follow the narrative, it feels like, it's a change in the narrative. And for me, there are some things that must live beyond election cycles. There are some things that must endure. And I worry that when election 2024 is settled, I just hope that it doesn't sort of do some kind of irreparable damage to the economic management team, who, the new one, or whichever one is constituted after the Akufo Addo administration, because we've always come to accept this conventional wisdom that it was a very important body, right, with a critical voice in how the economy is managed. And all of a sudden, I feel like its importance is being lowered, somewhat. I mean, yes, credit to the vice president. He does say that he is proud of the quality advice given to, cabinet and to the administration. But the overall public conversations, especially coming from those who are supporting his bid for the presidency, worries me that all of a sudden there's a bit of a lowering of the importance of the EMT, which hitherto was not the case.
Interesting. And I actually wanted to ask whether, because you talked about how it's a difficult path to navigate, whether to essentially say blame all of us for what has happened, as against blame me partly for some of the things that have blame the sitting president for some of the things that have happened. As for me, I really don't, you can't blame me because I did my best, except that my best were not appreciated. And so it's now my turn. Give me the chance, and I'll prove to you what I can do. Now, which of these two approaches would you say would best work for the vice president? Should he continue on this trajectory of quote and unquote distancing himself from some of the things that have happened with the driver-mate analogy, or you're going to tell him that stop that, it's not going to help you because you may end up creating some internal problems within your party because the president has his own support base, because lots of people who support him, sentimentally attached to him, if they get in the sense that you're trying to hurt him in order for you to advance your own political interest, they may not be happy. Or, my point is, which one is better for the vice president? Or you have an entirely different approach to how you think that the vice president could have done things in a way that, basically gives them a win-win situation.
Tough one. So yes, we always tend to say that the buck stops with the president, which is true, but it also takes collective efforts to be able to implement the policies and the programs of a given president and a given administration. And so for me, my view is you share, because it's a collective effort, you share in both the successes as well as the challenges that any given administration served. For me, when you do that, it sends a strong signal that you are a team, you're a team player. Because if the roles were reversed or if the tables were turned, I would want to believe that as president, Dr. Bawumia would greatly appreciate that sort of team approach or team thinking on the part of the people who would serve with him when it comes to both the successes and the challenges of the administration or of his administration should he get elected. So that would be my preferred approach. Yes, if there were things that he proffered advice on and he wasn't listened to, even that it would be a little bit, it would come off some way to even start publicly saying, I told them to do X and they ignored me, or I told them to do Y and they ignored me. Because for me, whatever internal deliberations occurred, at the end of the day, a certain view won, or should I say a certain view prevailed that said, no, but we still have to do e-levy. So good or bad, it's a collective effort and share in both the successes, and the challenges, because for me, it's a more positive thing to do it that way than to say, I had nothing to do with, I had nothing to do with this, or maybe my share of the quote unquote blame is this little. I'm not sure that it is a strategy that I would recommend, but who knows, maybe the team sees it differently and therefore may find a different way of trying to reconcile the two. You also don't want to come across as pushing your party under the bus. Right, because in that, for me, I don't think that is also a good signal, to send. You still want your entire party, and like you rightly said, I'm sure the president also has his own fan base or loyal base within the party. And at the end of the day, you want a united party going forward, which is why that balancing act has to be done very carefully without, making, others within the party feel as though you are. I don't think that's what the vice president is doing. But, perceptions can be a very interesting thing in politics. And so you don't want your words, your actions, or your inactions to communicate that message within the party that, this is all you're doing and I had nothing to do with this.
Interesting. Doc, I'm going to ask you, when I come back to you, my question will be to you, that what do you make of those who say that one of the ways in which Dr. Mahmoud Bawumia could have actually proven that he's a man who has courage of conviction would have been to say, look, if you're not going to listen to the advice that I'm giving you, then I better resign, because I don't want a situation where tomorrow I want to become president and people are saying that they can't trust me because I claim to be an economist, the economist not doing well, not because I don't have the ideas, it is because you are not listening to me, sir. So let me go and get somebody else to come in and do the job as a vice president. I don't want any trouble. You know, I've heard some people say that perhaps the vice president, quite similar to what happened between Aka and Rawlings. You recall that? You know, so people are saying he should have behaved like an Aka, and to give him some level of believability in his quest to assert himself as a man of his own. I mean, Bawumia should have done something entirely differently. It's that sort of thing. I'll come back to you with that question. So please hang on a minute. Let me come back to Dr. H.S. Kangu. Doc, you are in the business of political communication strategy. You're in the business of political framing. You're in the business of, in fact, you've written books, you're also an author. So for me, my interest, you sitting here, is to ask you that the man you saw at UPSA, how did the vice president come across to you? What kind of man did you see at UPSA? Is it a man who actually meant what he was saying? Did it look like a man who really and truly, would be his own man? I mean, what kind of Dr. Mahmoud Bawumia did you see at UPSA? That's what I want to find out from you.
Thank you very much, Moro.
Both in terms of what he's saying and what he's not saying, verbal and non-verbal.
Right. Thank you very much, Moro, and good afternoon to you. Good afternoon to our viewers, but and a very special one to Dr. Osai.
Sure.
Great to hear from him.
Yeah.
So in terms of the kind of man that we saw, the first thing that I would say, or generally speaking, this was a man who was in charge of himself, he was in charge of his convictions, and he was in charge of his policy. You could tell that this was an individual who had thought really clearly and very hard about what he was coming to say that day, and was aware of the broader context and the broader framework within which his speech was happening and within which people were viewing him. And so with that in mind, he decided to use the metaphor of somebody going in for a job interview. And he structured the speech in a way that said that, well, in order to be able to sell his message to Ghanaians, we can't take the context of that he's VP. So he needs to talk about what he has done, and based on that, also talk about his contributions to what has happened, and then in the future, talk about his vision to the people of Ghana. It's very few times that we've seen a vice president, very few times that we've seen a vice president who has been in charge of himself the way that he has been, and a vice president who has been very centrally involved in the formulation and also in the implementation as well as the advocacy of that particular message.
Okay.
So the basis of it is that because of that, he had a certain confidence in what he was saying because of his very active role in the current administration. Take it or leave it, he has been a very different kind of vice president. And if you look at the historical trajectory of who a vice president is, not just in Ghana, but across democracies around the world, the literature or the argument has been that the vice presidency has been one that has had a very limited and a very traditional role. I'll tell you one thing. I mean, when you look at the institutional role of the vice presidency, especially for scholars who have studied the makeup of the executive,
right?
There's the executive, there's the legislature, there's the judiciary,
right?
But then there are some who have actually studied just the executive alone,
right?
And the major players within the executive, because within the executive itself, there's a presidency, there's a cabinet, there's a minister, there's a bureaucracy, there's a government agencies, and on and on. And for those who have studied the institution of the vice presidency, one of the conclusions or one of the major narratives within the literature has been that the vice presidency has been one of those offices which have been very enigmatic and very difficult to define. Because although it is constitutionally mandated whatever in practice the vice president does, most often than not, lies to some extent on the authority and the empowerment within which the existing president gives him. Other scholars have made the point that the vice presidency is what the individual occupant makes of it. Even in an advanced democracy like the United States, I need to make the point that the vice presidency was an afterthought.
Right.
If you look at the drafting of the Constitution, most of the powers were concentrated in the presidency. And the vice presidency only became an afterthought when somebody raised the question of the absence of the president, and it came in. So for a very long time, you will be surprised that many people did not want to be vice president.
Okay.
A lot of people preferred to be in the Senate because they thought that would be more active. Okay. And not just in the US. Like I said, democratically, the VP-ship has been one that has been of very limited rule.
Right.
One particular scholar said one thing. He said, the presidency is the highest office of the land,
okay,
followed by the vice presidency.
Right.
However, the lowest office, the lowest ranking office in the executive is the vice presidency.
Okay.
You see the paradox?
I get it.
Second highest, but then also lowest ranking.
Absolutely.
Why that lowest ranking? Because there is a certain limitation,
okay,
in terms of what the VP can do.
Right.
But symbolically and traditionally, yes, is the highest rank. The reason why I'm giving this background is that it then gives us some perspective as to the institutional role that Dr. Bawumia has played.
Okay.
And that institutional role is that for the very, very first time, we saw a vice president who, to all intents and purposes, was very overt. I think that's something all of us can agree on.
Right.
He was very overt. He was very vociferous. He was very active. I call the model the activist vice president, or the policy-driven vice president, as opposed to the muted, the very traditional and the occasional and the symbolic one. So when you saw him stand there to speak to the people of Ghana, he stood there within the context. He was in charge of himself in the sense that he was very confident about the role that he had played in that particular administration. At a point, he said, many people have said that he's been one of the most impactful vice presidents. So in terms of the style, in terms of the style, the form, the nature of the vice presidency, he has indeed played a very significant role in reforming the role from a very, very limited or traditional one into an activist role.
Or advocacy-driven role.
Into an advocacy-driven role,
right.
Into an advocacy-driven role.
Right.
And in this advocacy-driven role, the first vice president who actually started it was called Walter Mondale in the US.
Okay.
And he initially said he was not going to take the position of the vice president. He prefers to be in the Senate unless and until he met with the president and decided what role he was going to play.
Right.
If they were going to give him an active role, then he would take it up. And Walter Mondale decided that he was going to be the kind of vice president who would be very, very interested in making sure that he just did not come to feeling, he wouldn't be a place or a position holder, a bureaucrat, but then he would make sure that he advocated for something.
Right.
This model of a vice president is what Dr. Bawumia took. And what did he advocate on? He decided to advocate on digitalization or on digital economy. He believes that that is what will bring this country forward. When you finish reading the speech, you are looking for one or some ideological, what kind of world are we going to live in when this president comes in? You do the thematic analysis, or you do the textual analysis, and you realize that one philosophical framework is that of inclusive innovation and growth.
Right.
Inclusive development through innovation and through technology.
Right.
He believes that technology is a leveler for all, but more so it is an enabler, something that will enable development in this country, whether it's through healthcare, through economic, through transportation, through industry. He believes that digitalization is a catalytic tool that would help to improve revenue and improve the lives of everybody in this country for the benefit of everybody. Because when the drones work, they go to the villages. When the efficiency is in the public system, we all enjoy it. And when there is also an increased revenue through the sealing of the loopholes, that revenue is what they are going to use to build and propel this particular country forward.
Right.
And so I need to say that a nation is built. A nation is made or destroyed based on ideals and based on ideas. The US is what it is because of it is the marketplace of ideas. What will move this country forward? He made that argument when he stood there at UPSA that this country needs to leverage on technological innovation in order to improve the lives of everybody in this particular country.
Right.
And I think that is what he moved very forcefully.
Okay.
The second qualitative point that he made was that he predicated his governance on the vision of possibilities.
Right.
And it is not just about economic growth or statistics, but then the values, the vision, the philosophies that underpin government are what eventually drive the economy or whatever kind of society that we have. And so he underpins his governance based on an ideological framework of possibilities that it is possible to get into the fourth realm of industrialization. It is possible for us to leverage technology in order to have the kind of futuristic, the kind of developed, the kind of modern society that we have or that we need as a country.
Okay.
So broadly speaking, that is the argument that he put forward when he stood there. And the body language, he was very confident. If you ask him about the non-verbal, he was very confident in what he was saying. He was very, very clear in terms of the how the clarity of the presentation, the ease of understanding, the connection to the Ghanaian people. Very, very clear and very confident in what he was saying. And I believe that the very, very, very factors that he decided to pin his speech on, which I've just mentioned, are things that he genuinely believes and are things that he has said that he's ready to promulgate when he moves forward.
I get it. Now, you talked about the activist, policy-driven or advocacy-driven vice president as he has positioned himself. Now, would you say that perhaps then explains why people say he cannot absolve himself or extricate himself from some of the ills that have happened in this government because you've been a very active vice president, never mind the fact that you don't have the final executive authority. Would you say some of the downsides of being an activist vice president, even an activist running mate, is what the vice president is facing now? And whether you'll agree with those who say that he is making a certain attempt to dissociate himself from his boss, and that may be politically catastrophic. Do you even in the first place get that sense after watching him and after listening to him that he attempts to distance himself? I'll come back with you on that. So Dr. John Osakwa will take a short break. It's just a minute. When we come back, we'll attempt to respond to this. Doc will leave us in the next 10 minutes. He has other engagements to do. So I'll come back to him for him to respond. He'll leave us, and then John Osakwa and I will end the show. Stay tuned in. Well, this is Good Afternoon Ghana on Metro Television. My name is Aldo Moro. We are having a conversation about whether, in fact, we're trying to answer the question whether the vice president, who's the standard bearer of the New Patriotic Party, is dissociating or distancing himself from the president, His Excellency Dr Akufo Addo. If indeed that is the case, is that smart politicking or not? That's what we're trying to answer on Good Afternoon Ghana today. Let me just quickly read some of the messages that you have sent us on the show. Let me do this quickly. So here we go. It says that Moro, how can someone who says that he was only a driver mate as a vice president and the chairman of the economic management team be busy touting his personal achievements under the same regime? I'd like to suggest that Dr. Bawumia to find something else to do instead of thinking and hoping the Ghanaians will be gullible enough to vote for people who don't want to take responsibility for their actions and inactions. Again, he can't simply be trusted. Sam from East Legon sends the message. And this one here says, Bawumia, among his pronouncements, 3 things stand out. He said after 2 years of NPP government, there would be no village with no water problem. So he said after 7 years, there's a crowd free from water on toilet, blah, blah, blah. So you don't add your names. It makes it difficult for me to read it because I've got to be able to credit somebody for the message. Okay, Dr. Mahmoud Bawumia can't run away from what his boss has done, the vim and vigor with which he was chastising the NDC when he was in a position has all turned to beans. He must cancel the e-levy and the 15% VAT on electricity now or never. That's come from Haj from Malam. Good afternoon, Moro. I am Kwame from Insawam. I don't know what politicians think about us. Dr. Mahmoud Bawumia should sit down and listen to his speeches from 2008 to 2016 before he comes to tell us that he has something better for this country. He said his boss has failed us, but is coming to give us having interesting times. Good afternoon to you and your cherished listeners. I think what happened to Ghana is a cause of our vice president. This vice president is something we've had in Ghana. It's a promise. His promise is just a speech. I don't quite get it. Alfred from Suotum said the vice president Bawumia knows his boss, the president, has failed, but he's feigning ignorance by committing himself by using and going around the same words Kennedy Japan used during the internal flag bearership elections and so on and so forth. So you didn't add your name, so I'm sorry, I won't be able to use it. Okay, I want to say a very good afternoon to a very good friend of mine, Jesse in Japan. Apparently you're tuned in. Jesse, I hope you're doing well. Well, one of these days we should be having you on the show to talk marketing, to talk political marketing and so on. So just get ready. Anyway, so let me do this. Let me, actually, I don't know whether you want to, I think I just go to Doc. Yes, go. So Doc. Hello, Doc. Hello?
Yes, I'm here.
Yes, so the question I asked before we went on break, if you can respond to it quickly, sir.
Can you repeat it?
Yeah, so
can you please repeat?
Yeah, so I asked whether should the vice president, for instance, have gone ahead to tell the president that, look, I'm advising you, you're not listening to me, right? I don't want a situation where tomorrow when I want to become vice president, I want to become president, people are going to use some of these decisions you're taking against me, especially based on all the things that I've said as far back as in from 2008 to 2016. It's either you listen to me or I'm going to call it quit. You know, would you think that would have been a more practical, I mean, is that practical? Is that feasible? Is that something the vice president should have done?
No, that's not something he should have done. And
Okay.
if you think back to the context you provided in terms of the late vice president Akar's situation,
yes, the
right?
Rawlings Akar matter.
I mean, yes, the Rawlings Akar matter. If you think back to that, it was not the best of relationships anyway, right? And we all, read stories about that famous cabinet incident. I think it was the December of either 94 or 95, one of them. So the relationship between Rawlings and Akar was a very different kind of relationship that deteriorated to the point where I can see why Akar would say, you know what, I'm out and I'm not going to do this anymore. The relationship with, President Akufo Addo and Vice President Dr. Bawumia is very, very different. You don't get the sense that it's an acrimonious relationship. I mean, even if you look at 2016 especially, the president, Nana Akufo-Addo, as a candidate, allowed him so much leverage. He was literally the face and voice of the 2016 campaign and in prosecuting the economic management arguments against the John Mahama administration. There would always be dissenting voices in any administration over any policy direction. There's a book we read in political science, which is an idea borrowed from, in economics, that talks about the three key choices that you face in situations like that: exit, voice, loyalty. I mean, you can exit, just like you said, by saying, you know what, I'm done, I'm out, goodbye. You can be loyal and say, look, I'm a team member, I'm part of this team. I wouldn't even say a word, good or bad, my party right or wrong, right? Or you can also use your voice, but you use it internally by saying, look, this is my advice, this is my objection, these are my issues. And then whatever decision unfolds out of that collective action, you go with it because you are a team player. The vice president did say in a speech that, he's proud of the quality advice that was given to cabinet. We don't know the specifics. We don't know the internal agreements or we don't know any of that, right? But for me, when all is said and done, at least what I perceive as the relationship between the president and the vice president is not one that I would agree with the notion that, for example, because let's say you opposed e-levy and the administration still decided to go ahead with e-levy, then you should have said, you know what, if the team won't listen to me, then then I'm out. I don't think that would have been, a good course of action to take.
But how about those who say that would have been ample testimony of his claim that he has courage of conviction?
But courage of conviction does not always translate into quitting as a member of a team.
Right.
Right. So it's, think about when we were kids and playing football, and we always would say the owner of the football gets to, call the rules. And if the game is not going his way, he takes up his football and says game over. Right. I mean, so at every policy disagreement, you're going to get up and say, you know what, my courage of conviction says I'm so deeply opposed to e-levy and you're moving ahead with it that I quit. I mean, I would expect, leaving a team over a lot more egregious things than a policy difference over whether, and not that it's not important, no, it is. But again, he also had room to do a lot of things as vice president, right? I mean, if you go through his speech, he cites a lot of things, particularly he did around digitization.
Right.
So if you balance the two, are you going to walk away saying, because I had this policy disagreement and they will listen to me?
Okay. Just briefly.
All the other things that I still get to do, I'm out.
I get it. But just briefly, if you can do this in 30 seconds. Did Dr. Bawumia shoot himself in the foot by deciding to reverse some of the policy decisions relative to taxes and levies that this president either intends to get it pushed by Parliament or that which is already in motion, like the betting tax and e-levy? Do you think that the vice president shot himself in the foot, or he did the right thing by saying, based on the kind of governance architecture that I intend to map out, I wouldn't need those taxes, and so I'm going to reverse them?
Yeah, I don't think he shot himself in the foot. And just like you rightly said, he has a particular vision. He has, there are particular ways in which he's thinking about some of these things. And so for him, if the e-levy doesn't fit within that fiscal architecture of his presidency, should he win, then by all means.
All right, Doc, thank you so very much for accepting to talk to us. I'll wrap up the conversation with Dr. H.S. Kanku. He's just got about 4 minutes to do his final submission. So back to the question I asked about, you're an activist vice president, you're seen all over the place, running mate and so on and so forth. Has he become a victim of his own circumstance?
Yeah, I mean, these are things that you cannot really avoid at some point. I mean, the fact of the matter is that an administration is not made up of just one individual, but they are made up of a team. It's made up of a team. And so, yes, definitely there's your idea alone cannot be the only idea that should reign or that should necessarily occupy preeminence over others. I think what he should, be doing moving forward is just to say that yes, we've accomplished a number of things together with the president. However, there have been challenges at times, and for me, I was a dependable partner. If you look at him, one of the lessons that you can learn from his leadership is that he never ever went into conflict with the president. He showed us what it meant to be a committed and a dependable partner in any business at all. And he served the nation well. He served in his role as vice president. And so moving forward, he has to acknowledge that, yes, there were challenges, but I was vice president. And when I became president, this is how I hope to move forward or to be different or to divulge from what the president did. Wonderful. And I believe he should be okay moving forward.
Thank you very much. Dr. H.S. Kanku is a political communications consultant. He's a political framing consultant. He's also the author of the book, The Modern Vice President. I want to thank you so very much for joining us on Good Afternoon Ghana. I also want to say a big thanks to John Osai-Kwapon, who is a CDD fellow. I'm talking CDD Ghana fellow and also a political scientist. I also want to say big thanks to you, the viewer. You've sent us tons of messages. Unfortunately, we can't read all of them. But what I can say is that I want to apologize that Shamima Muslim at the 11th hour something came up. She couldn't join us, but hopefully sometime, maybe Wednesday or next week, Monday, she will. Thank you very much for watching Good Afternoon Ghana. My name is Aldo Moro. Thank you once again and have a great day. Bye-bye.